I'd like to welcome everyone to the Research and Education and Innovation Week at Children's National. This is part of our ongoing week-long series highlighting different functions and activities of our CTSI-CN. This morning, I'm very excited about our session that will focus on ethics from two perspectives. One is talking about responsible conduct of research at Children's National, and the second is talking about a new initiative in the CTSI-CN covering issues about ethics, legal considerations, and social considerations as it relates to clinical and translational research. So we have two wonderful speakers. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Vanessa Madrigal. Dr. Madrigal is an attending in the Division of Critical Care Medicine and the Director of the Ethics Program at Children's National. She's board certified in Critical Care Medicine and General Pediatrics. Dr. Madrigal completed her medical degree at the Wright State University School of Medicine, her pediatric residency at Miami Children's, and her pediatric critical care fellowship at CHOP. In 2017, she completed a master's degree in clinical epidemiology with a bioethics concentration at Penn and a pediatric bioethics certificate program in 2009 in Children's Mercy in Kansas City. Dr. Madrigal joined Children's National in 2014 from CHOP. She became the official director of the ethics program and chair of the clinical ethics committee in June of 2019. And she continues with great energy to build on the program that Tom Silber established over 30 years ago. And so we're really delighted to welcome Dr. Madrigal to this series. And Vanessa, please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gabriel, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a privilege of mine to be here. Let me go ahead and share my slides. All right, here we go. So I am honored to talk to you today about our responsible conduct of research here at Children's National. This program is dedicated to essential to good science. The RCR program promotes the aims of scientific inquiry, fosters a research environment that enables scientists to work together towards a common goal, promotes public confidence in scientific knowledge, and progress for the public good. I am privileged to introduce you to some of the folks here that are dedicated to the RCR enterprise, to the sustainability of that environment, the practice of scientific investigation with integrity. And they have been essential to the development of the RCR curriculum that I'll present to you today. So what does the RCR program do? Well, first, we promote RCR. It's vital to maintaining the health of our patients and reputations of our institutions. The NIH defines RCR as the practice of scientific investigation with integrity. We also spread awareness and application, establishing professional norms and ethical principles in the performance of all activities related to scientific research. And finally, and as part of our excitement about talking with you today about this enterprise, is the RCR series. This is a monthly presentation where discussions are brought to all of you, the entire Children's National community, in related topics to RCR. They feature local and national experts. And I'll give you a brief taste of some of the presenters that we've had over the last year. In January of 2021, we had Dr. Pearl O'Rourke, who joined us from Harvard Medical School, and she discussed biobanking, a really exciting timeline where she has developed the biobanking at that institution over many previous decades, and lessons learned, which I think apply to many institutions now. And the discussions and questions and answers with her were just very exciting. In October of 2021, we had the privilege of having our very own Dr. Mark Batshaw discuss lessons learned from Jesse Geisinger. And he was very warm and inviting in sharing his experience. In November of 2021, we had our very own Stephen Teach discuss an interesting asthma, vitamin D, and equity consideration in clinical research related to some recent studies that came to public attention. And in December of 2021, we had our own Dr. Marshall Summer and Dr. Eric Villain discuss some conundrum in medical genetics. And finally, recently, in February of this year, we had some of our very own folks at this institution on a panel discussing recruitment of diverse populations across the lifespan and their own lessons learned. These folks are dedicated to recruiting diverse populations, and we really enjoyed hearing from them. So how do you find us? We have a website. Please visit this page and you'll hear you have the opportunity to listen to some past recordings. And important to note that the recording is up to the speaker's discretion, so not all of them are up there. And we want to share with you exciting new RCR events that are coming in the future. And so we hope that you'll join us. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I think we can pause for a sec because although the talks are related, they are distinct. And this one is pretty focused on what we're doing at Children's. So before I go on to introduce Professor Collier, do folks have questions for Vanessa? Please either put them in the chat, or it's a relatively small group. Please go ahead and speak up. So Vanessa, while people are thinking about their own questions, let me ask you something about your view on how we can really make RCR real. You know, so one of the things that folks have talked about is having your team come to smaller lab meetings to talk about either theoretical considerations that are pertinent to that particular lab group or specific considerations with that group. And let me ask you in this public forum, because this is not like the O.J. Simpson trial. I actually know the answer. Yes, Shanika, that was for you. You know, is this something that you folks have the bandwidth, interest to do, the bandwidth to do? And if so, how is it that a lab group or a research group leader could reach out to you and arrange for this kind of sort of real-time, rich interaction with your team?
That's a really exciting. That's a very exciting thought. We had not considered that in the past. I think that the way that we had designed this was looking at traditional RCR curriculums and trying to hit all of the things that those curriculums address over like a 24-month time span and do it in cycles so that folks can really kind of get the full breadth. There are entire courses and universities that are dedicated to this. So there's really a lot of information out there to cover. But what you are asking is perhaps more relevant to those individuals who need real-time information and who are struggling with something. And I think that that's a really important question. It would probably be more exciting truly to our individuals. So I think that that's something that we should bring to the group and discuss. And even now that we are able to perhaps be more in person, that might be nice to be able to do it in person as well. But even if we're restricted to do it by Zoom, certainly there's people at different sites as well at Children's National, so a hybrid might be an important opportunity. I think that that's something that we can build in. It's an exciting prospect. Thank you for that idea. So
one thought is, for example, in the Center for Translational Research, we have these special interest groups, and they are organized, as you know, at the grassroots, to deal with issues of in those group contexts of common interest around an aspect of clinical and translational research. So, for example, health disparities would be, one example. And so, a group of investigators might, like in the context of a SIG, might be able to invite you. Or there are some of us who run laboratory-based programs where we have collaborative interactions with one another within Children's. And perhaps we could bring a couple of groups together to discuss an issue that might be useful. And yes, it would be terrific to do it in person, but I think we've become so good at Zoom, and Zoom's allows us a level of facility that that we didn't really recognize before. So this might be something, and I would encourage people to think about these sorts of things so that there isn't a disconnect between the formal pedagogy and real world issues. Because as you are so great to put up this slide, you have a terrific team that really is very knowledgeable and can be helpful and informative. So thanks so much, Vanessa.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I thank you for that, and please feel free to reach out to any of those individuals that I put up there, or have Lisa shuttle you in our direction. And I do think that we have the bandwidth to address this in a way. So I really.
I note that Trey Schulbaum, who is an incredibly capable senior administrator, provides administrative support for your team. And so what I'd encourage people, because so many people know Trey, is if you have this kind of interest question, reach out to Trey, and she can help serve kind of as the interlocutor, the navigator between an interested group, and hopefully it's a representative of several smaller groups, an interested group, and the RCR group.
That's terrific. And when making these kind of presentations and advertisements in the future, that's something that we should deliberately speak up. Terrific. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for your time. And the program that you've been running for the last couple of years is just terrific. I've been to all the sessions that you put on the screen, and they've all been really, really informative. So thank you for the things that you've done.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay, so in this ethics space, we're going to switch gears, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Shanika Collier. Shanika is an associate professor in the Department of Clinical Research and Leadership at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Professor Collier teaches courses in bioethics and serves as a special volunteer at the Center for Research on Genomics and Global Health, the National Human Genome Research Institute, the National Institute at NIH. And several occasions in the past, she's taught genetics and the law as an adjunct at GW Law. And the reason that she has the expertise to do this is because she is trained as a lawyer. Prior to joining the GW faculty, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Genetic Research and Law, which is a interdisciplinary research for excellence funded by NHGRI. And this particular program was located in the bioethics department of Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. Earlier in her career, she was a practicing attorney in Washington, D.C. She also interned at the World Health Organization and the Neufeld Council on Bioethics, where she examined institutional healthcare ethics policies and human genetics law and guidelines. So she is uniquely qualified to really speak about this interface between law and ethics and medicine. And Shanika, it's just such a pleasure for me to introduce you to the group today and ask you to present your thoughts about an exciting new program that will be developed within the context of the CTSI-CN. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this event, and to also share my excitement about the development of ELSI related to health equity in recent years. So I'll start with my disclaimer that I have no financial or other conflicts of interest, of course, and that these opinions are my own. Here is my agenda. So first, I'll begin by defining ELSI for the few of us who are new to the acronym and the term. And then I'll describe momentum in ELSI and genomics more broadly to address health equity, starting with the ELSI research program at the National Human Genome Research Institute. And I'll end by discussing the exciting innovation that Lisa mentioned called the Law, Ethics, and Genomics in Society Accelerator that I have the great pleasure of leading. So to start, ELSI stands for the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Research Program. The program started concurrently with the Human Genome Project, the National Center for Human Genome Research, and the Department of Energy devoted funds to research, knowing that we would need to anticipate the potential vast and unintended consequences of sequencing the human genome. NHGRI devotes about 5% of its extramural research budget to funding ELSI projects. In addition, numerous other NIH institutes and centers support ELSI research and participate in one or more of the ELSI program announcements. It includes people from diverse backgrounds and disciplines. So I'm speaking with you today from a law and ethics perspective, but geneticists, medical professionals, anthropologists, sociologists, and more are engaging in the ELSI space. We engage as investigators, we provide advice, we provide public commentary. Some ELSI investigators do so embedded in genomics projects, and others are external and speak from the outside and have the academic freedom to comment on what they see happening. There are a number of ELSI areas. You can learn about the ELSI program on NHGRI's website, as well as its funding areas. These areas were revised within the past year. The prior areas were genomic research, genomic healthcare, and legal policy and societal issues. An education area also lasted for a short time until 2003. This new set of areas expands into categories that cover sociocultural structures and values, as well as institutional and system-level influences on genomics. Meanwhile, the genomics research and genomics healthcare areas have been updated to include more topics focused on health equity and engagement. If you take a close look at what is encompassed in these areas, you'll see numerous mention of topics on or related to social justice, environmental issues, conceptions of identity, systems-based influences on equity, as well as interest in data science. For those of you who would like to keep your finger on the pulse of national and global ELSI conversations, in addition to what will be happening among us in our group, you can visit this website and resource, which provides information on funding opportunities. The hub itself provides funding. It also provides a legislative database and a monthly Friday forum series on topical issues, among other things. After you finish attending today's sessions, you can watch recordings from past sessions, including the one today at noon. ELSI hosts a conference as well. This year's conference theme is Innovating for a Just and Equitable Future. So now on to the focus on health equity. And I'm bringing this up because Legacy will focus on health equity. Health equity will be woven into everything that Legacy aims to achieve. Off and on since the Human Genome Project, various scientists have raised alarm bells about an ELSI issue that I'll spend the bulk of my remaining time on, and that is the need for the genomics field to build an evidence base for all people. This report by the National Academies argues that building an evidence base is an important step in increasing access to genomic services. And once this base is established, they argue it can be used to better educate the medical community. The authors write, and I quote, "If we can stratify the population into subgroups that can be assessed using appropriate methods, we can ultimately drive better outcomes for the whole population." This was one of many calls to make genomics more diverse and inclusive over the past 2 decades. When I think about efforts to increase diverse enrollment in genomics research, I think of Henrietta Lacks. And it's not just because scientists extracted and created an immortal cell culture from her tumor in 1951. But because of the multifaceted and complex questions around the roles of race, identity, socioeconomic status, and intersectional identities in genomics. as well as the concept of benefit. As reported in this article, led by ELSI colleagues, Dr. Lee and others, participants may see biological specimens as an extension of self. The authors note that many of their study participants from different racial and ethnic groups mention the case of Henrietta Lacks as a cautionary tale when discussing the potential risks of research with biospecimens. Public fascination with Henrietta Lacks' story reminds us that marginalization, commercialization, identity, and notions of benefit are interwoven sensitive issues that the informed consent process and compliance with the common rule alone cannot address. The case of the Havasupai tribe provides a stark example of the challenges ahead. I am now recounting this story based on the work of my ELSI colleague, a Navajo tribe member, geneticist, and bioethicist, Dr. Nanaba Garrison. During the 1980s, Havasupai tribal leaders approached a trusted anthropologist with whom they had a long-standing relationship to resolve diabetes problems in their community. That anthropologist introduced them to a genetic researcher from Arizona State University to collect DNA samples and perform the study. The project provided benefits, direct benefits to the tribe in the form of diabetes education, but researchers did not establish a genetic basis for diabetes. Later, ASU researchers used the DNA samples to study schizophrenia, migration, and inbreeding, all taboo topics for members of the Havasupai. Dr. Garrison and her colleagues have noted in their extensive research related to this case that investigators made efforts to engage the community and build trust. However, they later breached trust in the community by conducting unwanted studies. Although the consent form, which was written in English, said the samples would be used for behavioral medical research, the tribe alleged its members were told that their samples would be used specifically for genetic studies on diabetes. A settlement was reached in the Havasupai tribe versus Arizona Board of Regents case in April 2010. Tribe members received $700,000 in direct compensation, funds for a tribal clinic and school, and the return of tribe members' DNA samples. As the case was settled outside of court, no new law was created. But the issue raised awareness that federal regulations do not adequately address community, cultural, and religious concerns about blood and DNA. Additionally, it has increased attention to the broad consent provisions of the common rule. Dr. Garrison and her colleagues emphasize there is, I quote, silence around justice and equity in genetic research involving Indigenous populations. She argues that while there may be shifts in attitude about informed consent in research, it is still unclear how to address the cultural concerns of Indigenous tribal nations. De-identifying samples or focusing on informed consent without also considering cultural concerns fails to ensure justice. Finally, although not noted by Dr. Garrison here because it was not a direct issue in the case, I wanted to note the tribe's relationship with the anthropologist. It reminds us that there's a lesson here related to trusted community partners and leaders that have an established relationship with groups, and the disruption we as researchers can cause those relationships when we rely on community partners, but don't partner in ways the groups find trustworthy. Arguing in favor of genomic sovereignty, Indigenous geneticists are not waiting for our regulatory and legal frameworks to change. Here is a photo of scientists who have started the Native Bio Consortium, incorporated in South Dakota. Genomic sovereignty generally refers to the interest of communities or nations in the commercial, scientific, or symbolic value of DNA and protection of communities against exploitation. The concept also proposes that populations can have special and valuable patterns of genomic variation that are also worth protecting, such as patterns found in isolated founder populations. The scientists pictured here are partnering with companies on their own terms and promoting a view that Indigenous tribes should have genomic sovereignty over Indigenous DNA. Some of their concerns are highlighted in this article by Dr. Keolu Fox. The concerns include access to agency to address power imbalances in genetics, opportunity to self-define their belongingness in research, and empowerment and self-determination in research. There has been a great deal of pushback against the concept of genomic sovereignty. For example, shouldn't we emphasize our shared humanity and our shared DNA sequences? DNA is described by international organizations as a global good. The idea that groups should control their DNA, some argue, undermines the concept of human solidarity. In addition, it slows the research process because it is a barrier to global data sharing. There is no doubt that the advocacy of Indigenous scientists for their communities is impacting our collective thinking on data sharing. I agree that we cannot wait for the law to change. A major ELSI issue going forward will be to address health equity questions around stewardship and governance. How, for example, can we develop a shared understanding of what it means to be stewards of DNA samples, respect the rights and dignity of local communities and groups, and also advance research for the benefit of the global research community? Similarly, countries around the world with low resources have experienced great interest in enrollment in genomics research because of the work we're doing on diversity and inclusion. However, they have also experienced a history of exploitation. They've experienced exploitation that has led to the use of terms such as helicopter research or parachute research to describe investigators who visit a country, collect valuable resources, and then leave. Samples are often removed from the south to the north, or low resource institutions to high resource institutions for the purposes of centralizing analysis, efficiency, the benefit of using state-of-the-art equipment. And I visited the campus at Children's. It's incredible. And these campuses are also costly to maintain. But even when contracts are signed, such as material transfer agreements that establish mutually agreed terms for samples and data sharing, I understand anecdotally from my own work with African investigators that some may never work with those samples or see their data again, or may never find out what happened to them. Further, by removing samples from countries in Africa, local investigators are deprived of the opportunity to frame questions by publishing first on their data and highlighting questions relevant and urgent locally. The Human Heredity and Health in Africa program is a major initiative on the continent, launched with $176 million from the Wellcome Trust and NIH. The consortium funds new collaborations among a Pan-African network of scientists. It builds genomics research infrastructure, and it has led to publicly available governance and ethics policies. H3 Africa's publication embargo policy provides an example of an approach that aims to enhance global data sharing by also promoting fairness. The data embargo policy provides that African collectors of data have a protected period of 23 months to publish their data. The policy directly addresses concerns about exploitation in North-South collaborations by supporting African data collectors, scientists, and institutions who garner trust locally while also investing time in building their research and their own publication portfolios. Other H3 Africa policies require that African principal investigators lead funded studies and that study questions center on African priorities. The working group conducts empirical research on H3 Africa policies and relationships. It will be good to see how well these policies have worked and barriers to implementation so that we can all learn from these attempts to promote equity. Now that H3 Africa funding has ceased, new efforts are supporting building data science research frameworks in Africa. Here are some other exciting national efforts taking place. The National Human Genome Research Institute hosted a virtual workshop this week entitled Future Directions in Genomics and Health Equity Research. The workshop aimed to identify research gaps and opportunities that would help decrease health disparities and improve health equity in genomics. The workshop leaders emphasized the scientific and ethical value of diversity and inclusion and covered a range of additional topics as they relate to health equity. In its most recent strategic plan, NHGRI has emphasized equity as well as the need for workforce diversity. It also stated its aspiration, and I read it as follows. If I can move the image of everyone out of the way. Research in human genomics will have moved beyond population descriptors based on historic social constructions such as race. For those of you who are familiar with my work, you know that I spent a lot of my time on that particular issue. The National Academies of Sciences has convened a diverse group of scholars to address the issue of population descriptors. The committee, which met in January and again earlier this week, is exploring questions such as how can we best represent factors such as identity, biology, and environment in our labeling systems. There is widespread recognition that the OMB census categories, which are almost ubiquitous in medicine and research, are inappropriate when describing global populations. Africa, for instance, has the greatest genomic diversity in the world. And when we use terms such as Black or African ancestry populations, we obscure differences between African groups. It has been shown, for instance, that the people from Maasai, the Luya, and the Yoruba ethnic groups have different likelihoods of responding poorly to the HIV drug abacavir. One of the biggest debates in science and medicine in the US currently is whether scientists should correct for race in medicine and what should be the role of race in research. Should it only be used to study racism, for instance? There is widespread agreement that race is a social and not a biological construct, but less is known about what we should do about NHGRI's bold prediction. The committee is also considering questions like those raised by Dr. Keolu Fox and his colleagues at Native Bio. What role, if any, should populations have in informing how they are defined? I'll wrap up this part of my talk by noting some of the attention that has been given to the discarding of data from underrepresented populations, another ELSI issue that should receive more attention. Even if we do recruit minorities to research or members of minoritized populations, will we use the data? Even when data from groups are available, many researchers discard them. Given how much time and effort it takes to build trust with underserved communities, we undermine individual and group altruism by not studying these data. A week or two ago, Mayo Clinic researchers reported that Black patients received lower quality genomic sequencing, resulting in incomplete data and a weakened DNA database. The researchers compared the properties of germline and tumor exomes between ancestrally African populations. They showed for the first time that diversity is not only low in quantity, but in this database quality. The authors speculated that the tools used to probe African ancestries might have been less effective than they are on European ancestries. Among its many characteristics, Africa has a long and complicated population history and significant variations in climate, diet, and exposure to infectious diseases. Our global genomics research community has not only been slow to include populations in research, but to develop tools tailored to diverse populations. And the focus on European ancestry populations has consequences for clinical cancer treatment for all other groups outside of Europe. As my colleagues who are geneticists and I discussed in this article, where we reported on publications about the promise of diverse and inclusive research involving African populations, that the inclusion of a relatively low proportion of people with African ancestry yielded unexpectedly high levels of insight about how to interpret genomic variations for all people. So inclusion is an ethical imperative, but it is also a scientific imperative. So to conclude this aspect of my talk, there's much work to be done by the ELSI and genomics research communities, but there is tremendous, I hope that I have shown that there is tremendous momentum in the here and now to address health equity and justice. And I lost my slides. Here we are. So now the Law, Ethics, Genomics, and Society Accelerator. So many of us at GW and Children's are leading efforts to ensure health equity in clinical and translational research, in genomics research. And so legacy is an opportunity to build interactions around our ongoing efforts and leverage what is already taking place here to solve problems locally and beyond. Legacy will build infrastructure within the research methods core and create resources, training sessions, workshops in a collaborative way with our other colleagues who are developing such resources. And the goal is for it to be a catalyst to bring together researchers and ELSI investigators. Some of us are steeped in questions as external or embedded advisors, but we can gather our resources to help frame and solve, as well as anticipate ELSI problems. It will anticipate ELSI in the CTSI, but also in the DMV through engagement with community and scientific stakeholders. My hope is that legacy will serve the CTSI and that we will also have an opportunity to share nationally and internationally how we are solving ELSI issues. But ultimately, the first thing we'll do is get started with a few events and work on building infrastructure to bring us together, build community, and work on addressing the legal, ethical, social, and public policy aspects of genomics, and eventually expand into other areas related to clinical and translational research, such as data science. Currently, we already have a very active ELSI community at GW and Children's, and a history of collaboration with the Center for Research on Genomics and Global Health at NIH. In the past few years, for example, we have hosted a number of face-to-face and virtual workshops on ELSI issues, and these events were all open to the public. In addition, we have a works in progress group that we are revamping to include data science, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. You can see we've had colleagues from the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at GW and Children's present at our works in progress groups. And legacy will build on this environment, build on the relationships we have to serve the needs of the CTSI and our patient and participant communities. Over the next few months, please stay tuned for the Legacy launch event, which will invite members of our community to showcase their work. We want to see what you are doing in genomics, ELSI, and health equity, and begin building community here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanika. That was just terrific, and so provocative in so many ways. We didn't see that last slide with ELSI, so if you could bring this up while we're talking.
Which last slide?
The slide where you were actually talking about legacy. That slide didn't.
Absolutely, sure.
And while folks are gathering themselves and thinking about questions, I would just want to share maybe an observation and a question. The first observation is with Henrietta Lacks. The way, having read the book, followed the literature, et cetera, one of the things that you said that really struck me today is that part of what went wrong, not just the paternalism, et cetera, but that there was a health equity issue. And to put it in the starkest terms, if Henrietta Lacks had been a white woman from an affluent community, would this have happened? And we don't know that. But what we do know is that these sorts of issues, you know, whether it is the Native American nation, whether it is the individual Henrietta Lacks, whether it is our research in low-resourced countries, and Africa as generally a low-resourced continent, we bring to our research implicit biases. And sort of not necessarily understanding agency, cultural issues, those sorts of things, that it doesn't necessarily mean we're being intentionally malicious, but we can do just as much harm by not recognizing our biases and not having true trusting partnerships. So that was an observation that I think the first part of your presentation really drove home for me. And I think that it raises an issue about, as we approach genomic investigations, thinking about equity, not just from the perspective of representation, as you pointed out, that's hugely important for the robustness of your data set, but also thinking about being sure you really understand the issues of different populations when you are trying to be representative. So I know, because we've had such wonderful conversation, and as you know, I'm so excited about your efforts to develop legacy. Thinking about your leveraging the community building, the partnership that you will have so that you can address and participate ELSI. Can you speak a little bit about your framework plan for providing consultative support to our investigative community? You know, I mean, bandwidth for one-on-one consultations may be a second or a third phase. But you know, what we talked about, for example, for your inaugural launch and the symposium, you know, bringing together, you know, speakers that can really sort of begin to shed light on these things that we just may not know that we don't know.
Mm-hmm. I thank you so much for your insightful comments, your reactions to the presentation, and also for your questions about framing how we can build an infrastructure that will help provide consultative services. And I think your first point in that part of the question is really, really important. What do we know? What don't we know? What's on the horizon? One of the first things I'm really interested in is the work that's happening here. The work that's happening in CTR related to pediatric genomics. And what are we doing differently here that may not be discussed widely in the ELSI community or happening at other institutions? So part of building that framework will involve a deep understanding of the research that's happening here and interest in working together on innovatively anticipating and solving ELSI questions that come up with regard to the work happening in the CTSI. Of course, I've been a part of teams that have had rapid consultation efforts where you could actually make a phone call and someone would provide feedback or response to a question. Depending on how resources develop and who we can bring on board to be a part of this, I would hope that we could develop a team working together with those who are already doing research ethics training and begin by having these conversations with those doing the conduct of research training in the CTSA and CTSI, and building on the training that's happening, but also raising awareness among all of those who are doing research ethics methods work. And from there, when we're all on the same page about what ethics looks like, we can all provide strong guidance and feedback to our colleagues.
Great. Thanks very much. Are there other questions? I see some of our regulatory office leaders are on the phone, and I think that one of the things that as we we've had such great talks this week. I mean, I'm reflecting on yesterday's talk by Cliff Lane about global studies, particularly in response to emerging epidemics, and in the case of COVID, pandemics, and how work in under-resourced countries and the kinds of partnerships that it takes. Some of those are some of the ethical issues that you talked about. I mean, some of the other kinds of points, even the editor of Science made, et cetera, et cetera. And so how can we kind of incorporate a really fundamental understanding of ELSI principles into our regulatory structure, into our support structure, so that as we help with study design, we're thinking about ELSI principles. As we think about regulatory approval, we're thinking about ELSI principles, that this just becomes part of the fabric of the way that we do research. I think that will help us advance health equity in clinical and translational research. And I'd love to hear other folks' comments. Actually, I'd love to hear your reaction, but I'd love to hear other folks' comments.
The word that comes to mind for me is co-imagining, co-developing.
Yep.
And working together, inviting everyone, but meeting together among the regulatory leadership and discussing, imagining, anticipating how we can address issues that are coming up in the CTSI, what our take is on issues that are happening around the nation and globally. But also, I really think that there's something we can contribute to in starting a new thread of discussion and understanding about untapped ELSI topics and issues. And we can be the first to provide models for regulation and ethics frameworks.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a really, really exciting possibility. Other comments from the folks? I think people are sort of processing and kind of thinking about things, and I hope one of your and my joint goals for this session was to sort of introduce this new initiative, as you pointed out, and I just wanted to reemphasize that our initial sort of kickoff event that really falls into the category of engaging with our scientific community, at a higher order level that we're working on for the fall. I would ask people to be on the lookout and certainly to consider participating in the ELSI initiatives as they roll out. And for folks who have specific ELSI issues, I think the CTSI-CN across our enterprise, children's and GW, would love to be one of the points of contact and integration. So again, Patrick O'Keefe and Trey Schulbaum, sort of taking the lead. I know that Shaniqua is always so enthusiastic and so informative in dealing with these issues. And as you heard in the first part of this session, Vanessa having such a strong interest in bioethics in medicine and sort of trying to bring our ethics and regulatory assets together to be a network that supports the legacy initiative. So
Lisa,
yes, Patrick.
Sorry, we do have a couple questions in the Q&A function there for.
Oh, terrific! I'm sorry, I didn't see them. So I appreciate it. Thank you, Patrick, for calling it out. So Shaniqua, Sheila Garrity asks about a great point. She didn't specify it exactly. So maybe Sheila, if you're still there, you could say specifically your point about the thing that caught your attention, because it was clearly a point that maybe some people shy away from, and your important caution that we shouldn't be afraid to have discussions around some of these sensitive points, even when we're not absolutely sure how to do it in the most informed way. Okay, we may have lost Sheila, so let me move on to Kristen Breslin's talk. We expect investigators doing research in international settings to obtain local regulatory approval. Is there a role for that with Indigenous communities, for example, here in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. You will have to work with Indigenous tribal nations and their policies for engagement. Some nations, such as the Navajo Nation, are only just beginning to engage in genomics research again. And they're doing it by working with people like Dr. Nana Garrison, who's helping to develop policies that are acceptable to the Navajo Nation. And so whenever working with an Indigenous nation, it's critically important that you are aware of any types of policies, moratoriums, or investigators who have become sort of the face maybe of the group, and ensure that you are following protocol related to that Indigenous nation.
Lisa, I'm still here and Patrick found a way for me to talk. So sorry, it took me a minute to figure that out myself. So my point, when Shanika said something about these discussions. So I was fortunate enough when I studied public health at Hopkins to have as my advisor Matusa Tosham, who runs the American Indian Health Center at the School of Public Health at Hopkins. And I also got a certificate in health and human rights. And what we struggle with, we as white people, as not minorities, is being afraid to have this discussion, being afraid to offend people, and we can't. We have to find a way to talk about these uncomfortable issues. So that was really all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I sort of, from the way you pitched it, I thought that probably was your point, Sheila, and it's the greater point, putting your head in the sand and avoiding these important issues as we kind of try to build toward a more perfect and representative union isn't going to get us there. I mean, it may save a moment of being uncomfortable, or even you're embarrassing yourself, you're being vulnerable, but it isn't going to get us to where we want to be. So being humble, being honest, trying to do things in the context of building trust, and being willing to admit, I don't know. And hopefully doing this in a supportive environment where someone whose perspective could inform and expand your perspective is willing to engage you in the conversation. And I think that boils down to having safe spaces to have the discussion. And I must say, having just worked with Shaniqua for the past year, I think she is one of those people that has a wonderful natural ability to create safe environments, particularly for difficult conversations. And this is difficult. And one of the things that is a little bit pressing right now is that the NIH extramural programs around ethics, law, social implications of research, those centers are not going to be supported in the same way. So it is up to us to come up with strategies where we can interface with NHGRI, where we can continue the discussions, and where we can really establish in our local framework the importance of dealing with these issues and having kind of a living ongoing experience as they come up, that we try to get to the best possible solution. To that end, Shaniqua, there is an anonymous question. What are your thoughts about replacing race with racism when we're evaluating disparities in health equity?
Thanks for that question. There are so many variables that lead to disparities and health equity challenges, structural racism being a major one. But I would be in favor of identifying and studying the different variables. If it is the social construct of race and racism, then study that. If it's educational attainment, if it's proximity to a toxic waste dump, if it's gender, if it's skin color. As a research community, we have not been very precise about the factors and variables that we're studying. And we use categories and broad social categories to encompass so many things that we have difficulty measuring. And so what I hope for in the future is that we develop better tools and approaches to measure differences in a better way. I think very broad categories mask differences within groups and sometimes render people invisible. And I would like to see us move beyond that.
Great. No, that's incredibly helpful. I mean, again, the Rumsfeld threes. To a certain extent, we know what we know. To a certain extent, we know what we don't know. But there's a big piece of this where we don't know what we don't know. And, and trying to get to a point of being more comfortable, we make all kinds of assumptions and really sort of saying, stop. What is it that we know? I think that's really such an important point. What I might like to close on, of course, I'll give you the last word, Shaniqua, but Alavi Sauce makes a comment, not a question, that he absolutely supports regulatory conversations around ELSI and research. So here are the titular leaders of the regulatory programs at Children's and with Sheila Garrity at GW saying that they welcome ELSI conversations. And so I guess to a certain extent, this now, puts the ball in the court of investigators. Don't be afraid. Bring things up. Challenge your own research and your own assumption and your own biases so that we can get to a place of better equity in the kinds of clinical and translational research that we pursue. And Shaniqua, I'd love a sort of final set of thoughts from you.
I'm looking forward to working with Sheila, Vanessa, others on the call, Alavi, on creating some spaces where we can have conversations with each other, with our colleagues, and create an atmosphere to begin having these conversations on campus and virtually.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank you, Shaniqua, and I want to thank Vanessa for wonderful presentations. This last part of our discussion was really exciting, and I would say to the community, stay tuned, because this is an area we've been working on for a while. Tom Silver, for example, here with bioethics, set the stage 30 years ago, but I think this is an inflection point, and an inflection point bicamerally, if you will, both at Children's and at GW, and hopefully the CTSI-CN can be kind of the interlocutor bringing us together around these issues. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to the folks that participated in this session.